Hello and welcome to Identity Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue. Today is episode 159. The topic is the rise of JIT access, just-in-time access. Our guest today is Shashwat Sehgal, co-founder and CEO of P0 Security. Welcome, Shashwat.
Mike, nice to be here.
And before your first time Identity guest, so before we dive into the topic of just-in-time access, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your background.
Absolutely. So, obviously, in my current act, I'm the founder and CEO of P0 Security, and we are the next gen PAM or Privileged Access Management platform for the modern enterprise. And I've been doing this for the last 3 years, a little more than 3 years. And uh, my act before this was be a product leader at various places, and before that I was an engineer. So my career in Silicon Valley has followed the track, I guess, which many founders do. Start off as an engineer and then move over to the product side and eventually start a company. And so here I am.
Um, okay, awesome. So I'm going to actually start, before we start with just-in-time access, actually want to maybe create a little bit of context. And in the episode description, you talk about 77% of the breaches begin with compromised credentials. I guess it makes sense that saying that while you're in the PAM sector. But I wanted to sort of dive into that number a little bit and just get your thoughts on what percentage of that 77% you think are human workforce credentials and what percentage are maybe service or software accounts of that 77%.
You know what the scary part of that question is? Nobody knows the answer to that question,
Mm-hmm.
right? I could make up a number and it would just be that, a number. And that is the unfortunate reality in our space that, especially in privileged access management, right? What are the scope of systems that PAM covers? PAM, at its very core, if you strip away all the noise, PAM helps organizations answer the question, who has privileged access to my most sensitive systems, such as my production stack, my production applications that are running in AWS, my own data center, GCP, Kubernetes, Azure, you name it, right? Uh, who has access to these applications, whether that's a human user or whether that's a workload? That is the fundamental question that PAM answers. And if you start off with this definition of PAM, uh, you realize that most of the applications, most of the code that is running inside these privileged systems, these are usually built by developers who inherently do not care, not that they don't want to, but security is usually not their expertise. And what happens is, okay, we are setting up a new service, let's just provision it with a static credential. Or, hey, I'm a user, I need to get to um, a virtual machine running in AWS. Hey, here's a static SSH key, and you know what? You can while you use it, you can also have standing access to that server, even though it's running all the different production applications. Right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not because people don't want to solve this. It's more that mostly developers do not have the security expertise, and even when they do, building applications, building the business logic usually takes a higher precedence, a higher priority than securing, laying the groundwork for security. And then the unfortunate consequence of this is that all these problems compound, and after a while there's the inevitable breach, and it's very difficult to pinpoint, is it down to a credential theft, or is it down to an overprivileged access, is it down to a user, is it down to a workload? um, And the reality is that uh, some kind of identity related misconfiguration, whether that due to a credential, whether due to over provisioned access, is the factor behind, anywhere from 50 to 80% of security breaches, right? And it just becomes very difficult to um, get down into the granular details and figure out which of these breaches are due to what factor. So I don't mean to be an alarmist out here, but unfortunately, that's the sad reality of our industry right now.
It sounds like what you're defining is what I would call chaos.
Yeah, well, identity is a chaos at the moment.
The when I think of the word governance, I think of the word government. Those two words are closely related, and the opposite of a government is an anarchy, and you call an anarchy chaotic. And so, an absence of governance, I would say, also leads us to chaos. And what you're describing sounds a lot like chaos to me. Um, but I don't. I'm saying I actually agree that you're right. I think this is where we are today, and and you're right that security developers, a lot of developers default to bare API keys, not even credentials, just secret usernames. I think a survey by Asterisk Security showed that like 45% of the MCP servers were using static API credentials on GitHub. Um, I wanted to pivot back to the white paper. The one of the white papers on the homework was called CISO First Principles, and you talk about the goal of security is to protect sensitive company assets from misuse by the workforce. Um, and I wanted to actually ask you to maybe shed some more light on what you can define as the workforce. Does that include third parties? What about fourth parties? And what do you do about ephemeral agentic identities? Are they part of the
Yeah.
workforce? And at
Short
that point,
answer
is
is
the
yes.
workforce really the best way to describe this anymore? You
Yeah.
know? So what's your definition of workforce here?
Short answer is yes.
They're
Well,
all workforce.
they're all workforce, right? But jokes aside, right? What is a workforce? I believe in answering any question
Hmm.
strictly from first principles. And if you think about it, workforce is an entity that can take an action on a company asset, right? 20 years ago, when all of us used to sit in physical offices,
Hmm.
company assets were laptops, desks, workstations, and the
Employees are workforce. I think everyone, that's what I think of when I think of workforce is
absolutely,
actually human
absolutely,
employees. Yeah.
absolutely, and increasingly so. Workforce also includes contractors because, well, they can also take action on company assets. But more importantly, the digital workforce, right? The digital workforce could be a service account. It could be an IAM role. It could be a workload. And increasingly so, your agents, right? If you have an SRE agent or if you have a SOC agent, what's to say that that's not part of your workforce? Right? They can take actions on your sensitive data, for sure, your sensitive assets. In some weird way, they are on your payroll, right? You may not be providing health insurance for your SOC agent, but you are paying for that. You're paying a vendor for that agent, right? Or if you've built something in-house, you are paying storage and compute to AWS for it. Uh, so it's very much a part of your workforce. And in this day and age, the definition of workforce has expanded to beyond just humans sitting in one physical location to all these distributed entities, which could be anywhere in the world, either physical or virtual. And that is really what's necessitating so much investment in identity security, because that is the only way to secure this workforce.
So I totally understand contractors being workforce. I mean, after all, they're just paid differently than employees, but they're basically still humans
Yeah.
accessing company systems. But a lot of applications today are SaaS applications, like ServiceNow or Salesforce, right? Um, and so the policy the and those are critical company assets, right? Um, what's more critical than your CRM? And yet, um, the people who we might want to make policies about, they're not even in my domain. Like the engineers at Salesforce are, they're not people enrolled at my company, and yet there's risk to them accessing my critical assets. So if I'm just wondering, so they're technically third parties, and then there's fourth parties. Salesforce might actually have a SaaS that provides a certain part of their service that they contract, who also has access. So it seems if I'm listing all of the company assets, those company assets might have security policies that don't actually involve any like humans that I actually am governing. So how could I possibly govern the risk?
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head, right? I mean, supply. There's a reason why supply chain keeps getting called out as a big risk. And as you rightly pointed out, supply chain isn't just open source, the open source software that you're using in your applications, right? There's also the human component to supply chain. It's not you. Everyone is using SaaS, and those SaaS have, at the end of the day, real humans and contractors behind them as well. That is a big part of the identity risk that we deal with.
Yeah, it seems to me like um, the um, just that I need an approach that actually encompasses all of that risk. And just because there's no human who works for me who has access to that asset doesn't mean I can stop thinking about it or I don't need to manage that risk. Um, and we did have an episode about third party risk on Thursday. Yeah, last Thursday. Um, we had um, Kamal Govindaswamy, who's an expert sort of in third party risk. So yeah, but it just seems like interesting that the very definition, like we're trying to talk about here, the first principle of security, to protect company assets from misuse by workforce, that definition itself doesn't merely work today. Um, and so let's pivot to just-in-time access. And if you're talking about just-in-time access, it seems like somewhere there has to be some type of dynamic authorization engine that's going to evaluate policy. And I'm curious, so if you think that's the direction we go, what does that authorization dynamic engine look like?
Great question. So let me back up here and talk a little bit about the history of access, right? Um, at the end of the day, just-in-time access, when it comes to privileged systems, is it's not a new concept. It's been around for a while, but it's been morphing in different forms. I want to start off by why this is the right approach for risk reduction. As you rightly pointed out, in the supply chain of identity security, there are employees, there are non-employees, non-users, agents everywhere, right? And sometimes there are chains of these entities that are trying to access company data. So the very first step, uh, an important, a necessary but insufficient step, is for an organization to have a full inventory of who has access to what, right? Why I say it's necessary? It's necessary because without having a full picture, there's not much you can do at all in terms of policy. How do you even design a policy?
I'm willing to, if we could hit pause there for just 1 second, I'm willing to say that I agree that governing the people you're responsible for is what I would call table stakes, um, or basic hygiene that every responsible company should onboard and offboard in some way. And I'm not sure what that looks like exactly, if that's, but but yeah, certainly governing the people that you're responsible for is important.
Ab-
However, it will only ever be a subset of your risk, though, right?
Absolutely. Well, when I say people, I mean every entity. I use the word people loosely. It's really just the expanded definition of workforce that I'm talking about, right?
Hmm.
Every entity in that supply chain needs to be governed. In fact, what you should be doing is mapping out the access path from any identity to your sensitive data.
Wait, can we hit pause right there?
Yeah,
So, a lot of the identities are ephemeral. So I'm a process that spools up on a server, and I attest to a certain provenance. Let's say I know I'm running on Amazon's work like servers, and I'm from this domain,
yeah,
or I'm even from my own domain. I'm even an internal. When you say we want to manage people and software in the same way, the onboarding process for a person is really different than for software. How
100%.
would we deal with ephemeral software and entities?
100%. I love it that I love that you raise that nuance, and the outcome is the same. The business outcome is the same, that there should be some governance controls around both static physical identities like users, as well as ephemeral digital identities like workloads, right, which could be spawning up and down, right? But the form factor of the way you achieve them is different, and maybe I'll get to that in a bit, right? uh the idea being that um there was this need to govern, which is the necessary step, but it's insufficient, because what organizations are really just looking to do is not just gain intellectual visibility, but at the end of the day, set and enforce policy, right? And those policies could be different, and those the form factors of the products could be different, whether that's a user, whether that's a workload. Um, and because of the sheer complexity of any modern environment, what I'm what I'm going to argue is that the only way to set policy consistently without blowing up your policy language, without blowing up your uh, governance rules in a maze of complexity, is to keep things really simple, and say that every access by default should be short lived and just in time, and there should be a very compelling reason to make any kind of access static, right? And the moment you take this philosophy on, it simplifies things dramatically. What it means is that you don't have to forever keep going down the rabbit hole. You don't have to keep playing the whack-a-mole game of, hey, should this person or entity have access? Yes or no? Let's review it every 3 months. And then it's a whack-a-mole. Okay, this person should have access. This person should not have access. This entity, this service account has the right access. Maybe we need to resize this. You see what I mean? Who's the owner of that? It just puts a stop to all of it, and keeps things very simple. Hey, in a we are an organization, we believe in zero trust, and zero trust means by default you should have zero standing privileges, and any access by definition, we're going to treat it as a privileged access. And if you need privileged access, it should go through a just in time workflow. And what that workflow looks like I said, is different for users as it versus uh, non-user entities, non-human identities. And it's that difference in workflow which makes the actual provisioning different. It gives it a different form factor.
So, and I agree with you that ideally permissions to access should be short lived. and revocable.
Yeah,
You change your mind, maybe um, maybe you gave, even though we're short-lived. Short-lived could be a minute, but maybe 30 seconds is long enough. Um, and so I'm completely with you on this, but you still need some type of um, authorization engine. Like I still don't get from how you say we should make these policies to implementation. Like, how do you
love it.
actually express these policies?
Love it.
Um,
Okay, so as I was saying, the concept of just-in-time access has been around for a while. And 20 years ago, let's examine how it was implemented.
mhm.
Um, 20 years ago, the definition of a privileged asset used to be a physical server or a physical database residing in a corporate data center. And the way people got privileged access was the the definition of privileged access was access to the admin account on these physical boxes.
Yeah, they were glorified password vaults.
They were password managers, right? And over time, the name for a password manager at enterprise scale became a vault, or maybe it was the other way around. I don't remember, but either way, right?
Yeah, how do you get the root password?
Yeah,
Well,
the,
show you're
the
this person, hit unhide, copy it, and then put it into your program just when you need it. But
absolutely,
but PAM's evolved. In my sort of cynical view of PAMs, I see PAM as always encompassing a subset of applications. So the worst case scenario is every application's a one-off. That's the worst. So PAMs take a number of systems, 5 here, 10 there, and they tie them together into one control plane. So now instead of having 50 or 100 one-offs, you now have 5 20-offs, and that's better. And the PAMs introduce other features like session recording. I'm a big fan of Teleport. Does this using eBPF. So it's not just about the privilege access today, but sometimes also about accountability. And so if somebody types RM minus RF, you can't use the system logs to find out what happened. So you need as actual session recording. So I see, the growth of PAM is like good hygiene, good security hygiene for those types of systems. And yet each PAM system is an admission that we failed because no one PAM system will ever encompass everything. So PAM is always a compromise for a subset of systems. Is that
absolutely,
right?
absolutely, and as you know, to your point, just-in-time access for those original password managers was implemented by at the authentication level, which was, hey, take a temporary password, use it just in time, and then
Hmm.
once you've used it, we'll revoke it and rotate it.
Right.
Right? And this is what just in time access meant for a long time. It was less just in time access, it was more a just in time credential,
It's
right?
just provisioning.
Yes, it was a just in time provisioning of a credential.
Yeah.
uh, and then what happened
A
was,
pragmatic approach, by the way.
yeah, it was programmatic. Yeah, I mean, look, it worked until it didn't.
Yeah.
When did it work? It worked as long as the environments were static. There weren't a whole lot of ephemeral credentials popping up left, right, and center. Because the moment credentials started popping up, what it meant was, there were way too many ephemeral workloads, etc., and you couldn't possibly secure credentials to each and every one of them, right? Because there were so many in a modern cloud, and they were also spinning up and spinning down on demand.
And by the way, the static method of credential management that you're talking about, ultimately tied back to RBAC.
Yeah,
You had access to the credential because in the vault you had a certain role which gave you access to certain credentials. The credentials themselves are binary. Once you have that credential, you have all the abilities of that credential, whatever it has.
yeah.
Um, so okay, so the new what is the new approach? the new approach seems like we need a more nuanced way to make these policies rather than grant access to everything. So how do we actually get that more control over this access than what we had?
Yeah. So there is a new way, but before I get to the new way, I'll maybe talk about the on ramp, or the mid, the sort of in between way to talk about just in time access, right?
Hmm.
Um, just in time credentialing was obviously one, and another way that people tried to implement access in a just in time manner was, okay, let's just create groups in our identity provider, let's attach the privileges to those groups as needed, and then maybe we could add users to these groups in a short-lived just-in-time fashion, right? Like there's a
Yeah,
developers group. Let's make sure if someone who wants to have on-call privileges gets added to an on-call developer group for 2 hours.
right. So they don't need the actual credential as long as they're in the group, they have access. So the
Exactly. Exactly.
application is savvier. We can
Exactly.
pass it the enterprise roles or groups. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So this also works to an extent, but again, it's a very static way of provisioning access.
Not
Why?
very expensive.
Yeah, it's very static. It leads to lots of standing access to people in the group. You have to make sure that group, you're reviewing the members of that group on an ongoing basis. Most of the time, people even don't even know who's in what group and what group leads to what privileges, uh,
Right.
right?
Also, I'll point out from a federation standpoint, it can lead to challenges because if you release the groups for the person, you might overshare with the application all the security groups at the company. And so how do you filter the group's response based on RP can be a challenge. So there's a lot of challenges with this.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah,
Yeah.
so then we have a next step
Yeah.
after group.
The next step is what we call as provisioning or just-in-time provisioning, uh, just-in-time authorization provisioning, right?
Hmm.
What do I mean by that? It means that in, if you as a developer want access to a virtual machine, which is again the cookie cutter PAM use case,
Hmm.
um, instead of issuing a static credential, um, so the Gen 1 was what I call as issuing a static credential. That is what the password managers and vaults were based on.
Hmm.
Gen 2 was, hey, set up these groups and you have standing access to those groups, but those groups achieve nowhere near the kind of granularity that you would like to implement in an enterprise. And instead, Gen 3 is what I call as just-in-time authorization, which attacks at the very core level of access, which is what we are saying is that, instead of provisioning credentials, you should be provisioning authorization. Or in other words, imagine if you have a a house with hundreds of different rooms, and a person needs to get to a specific room on the third floor, right?
Hmm.
Let's say we are talking about the White House. So authentication meant giving someone the keys to the front door of the White House, and authorization means instead assuming a breach has already occurred, assuming that everything is zero trust by design, just giving any entity authorization only to a specific room which they require for completing their task. Or, in other words, to keep things very simple, if I'm a user, um, and if I'm trying to get to a virtual machine, just-in-time access and just-in-time authorization specifically means creating a temporary policy or creating a temporary role and giving my corporate identity that role, so that all I can do is get access to that virtual machine and nothing else.
So what do we have to do on the um, what do we have to do on the application to get it to use that dynamic authorization capability? Because you said initially a lot of the developers are not very sophisticated. It's hard to change their behavior. What's the ask for developers to get them to support this new dynamic authorization capability?
Well, speak to P0, right? But jokes aside, right? I mean, at least the way we solve this problem
Uh-huh.
is we connect seamlessly to the most common sensitive resources used in production. We connect to all three big clouds. We connect to a wide variety of databases, Kubernetes systems, code repositories, CI/CD pipelines. And the idea is take any system, connect it to P0, and we function as the control plane for any authorization in that system. And so if a developer or if any user wants access to any resource within that system, they can ask P0, and P0 will provision a temporary policy, a temporary role that is tightly scoped to that resource. And then once their work is done, they can just stop using that role and be done with it.
Okay, so so in P0 SaaS platform, you have basically you configure your policies, and then you configure your target application somehow to connect to P0 so for security.
Yeah.
Um, okay, that's fine. I don't want to dive too deep into the product at this point, but we're saying we need to do something on the product, the target system, and then something, and then you're inserting a cloud control plane for
Exactly.
that.
Exactly. The right way of solving this problem should be at the level of authorization and not authentication. Your authentication into a system should always be federated with your identity provider, or if you're using Okta, or if you're using Entra ID. um, there's a reason why single sign-on exists. You should not, for any sensitive system, you should not be using static credentials. You should not be using shared passwords, shared accounts. Every access should be linked to your corporate identity, and you should be logging in as your corporate identity with MFA and SSO turned on. That is the best practice everywhere, right? And then after you've logged in, that's when your access should be controlled at the layer of authorization by issuing short-lived roles and permissions and policies to get you into the system of your choice.
So if I could just ask one technical question on this, P0 needs to issue something to that target system that conveys that authorization um, or the updated policy. Um, is P0 issuing some type of JWT that becomes the basis for that policy execution?
Well, actually, we just provision a policy and we don't worry about the tokens, right? Again, like I said, the authentication is delegated to the identity provider.
Right. But when P0 somehow, let's say P0 does the authentication or evaluates the authentication from the IDP, and then it makes a decision, Mike needs to get to this VM, and this is desired. So does P0 then issue some type of token which is consumed on the client software in the VM that says, oh, okay, here's an attestation or an assertion from P0 Cloud that I can trust. And here are the claims in that I'm trusting. So I'm wondering if the mechanism that you're using to convey that authorization decision that got made, is that actually being conveyed as a JWT? Or is there some type of synchronous connection between maybe a TLS connection where every decision gets evaluated through the cloud? Just wondering how you convey the trust to the target system.
Yeah, we that is part of what we do, right? But ultimately, we are not the ones making a policy decision. We are just creating policy, and we are allowing the decision to be made by the target system itself,
Mm-hmm.
right? So we are not the policy evaluators. We are just the place where policy is kept, and it is and the evaluation of the policy is still done by the target system based on the rules that are set within the P0 engine.
Right. All right, let's pivot a little bit. I wanted to move on to something else that I like from your white paper, where you say modern identity programs can't stop at provisioning and access enforcement, they need continuous assurance that access posture in the environment still matches policy intent. Um, so I really like that idea, as you say, of continuous assurance, because I like to say that a policy without an assessment is a recommendation. And so you need evidence, like as you say, that the outcome matches the intent of your policy. Um, what type of infrastructure do you need in place, though, to gather that evidence? And why isn't that happening today?
Yeah, look, I mean, ultimately it goes back to what I was saying, that the the right path for an organization to start thinking about modernizing its PAM is to first start off by with this necessary but insufficient um, step of posture and visibility. Then the next step becomes use that visibility to set policies, and lastly to enforce those policies. But it doesn't stop there, right? Organizations change, people come and go, workloads spin up and down, so there's always some amount of natural entropy or drift in
Mhm.
in the IAM state of a system, right? Permissions change, new roles and credential come up. Unfortunately, static credentials also come up. So there needs to be a continuous reevaluation of the posture, followed by updates to the policy and enforcement. It's not a one-time set and forget, right? There's a reason why access reviews have existed for us as long as they have, even though many of us believe that they are pretty performative at many organizations, right? But there is a component to, there is some grain of truth to the fact that to make an identity program robust, you have to have this continuous cycle of posture followed by policy definition, policy updates, followed by enforcement, and rinse and repeat.
Um, and so one of the ways that we would then report this sort of continuous process of policy, then evidence collection and evaluation, this sort of loop, the continuous loop of policy, is by collecting metrics. And I'm wondering, and you mentioned in your white paper the idea of outcome-driven metrics, and I'm wondering what are those metrics and what are the outcomes that we should look at for a continuous program?
Yeah, the metrics should be across the key pillars of authentication and authorization. So for authentication, it means um, actually even starting from user provisioning. So the first metric is how many of your identities are owned by your identity provider and have a unique human user as a reviewer attached to them. On the authentication front, it means how many static credentials exist, um, how many of your users are using uh, SSO MFA, and how many of your workloads have short-lived credentials like STS tokens. And on the authorization front, it means how many of your users and your workloads, your agentic identities are least privileged. To what extent are they using just-in-time authorization for access, and so on and so forth.
I had a guest, I think 2 weeks ago, and we were chatting about governance, and he said to me that the three things that he looks for in a governance program um, are risk, um, transparency, um, and accountability. And and when we talk about outcomes, right? There's a going back to Kamal Govindaswamy from last Thursday. He talks about, in line with what you're saying in your white paper, that we want to look at objectives, not means. Um, and so I like your idea. So combining those two ideas, I wonder if the objectives are risk, transparency and accountability, that those
Love it.
are the things that we
Love it.
actually met.
Love
I
it.
wonder
Those are the
what is
things that matter.
the relationship of underlying things like SSO is a means, but it's not actually an objective. So I wonder if those are the right things. And I think this question about metrics is really difficult, because the question is really, what is the right metric for measuring risk? And how do we get from who's doing SSO to actual risk? How do we quantify risk? And because I didn't hear you telling me how we're quantifying risk. And if
Yeah,
the goal of security is to inventory, protect our company
love it.
assets,
Love it.
we're
So,
doing
so
that.
here's how these would map, right? So you said risk, transparency, and accountability, right?
Yes.
Accountability means every identity is managed and every identity has a human owner associated with it, right? So the level of accountability is how many of your identities are managed with a human owner.
Let me push back on you a little bit on that.
Yeah,
Accountability can mean a human for sure. There's the cliche, which I don't like in our industry, about having a throat to choke. You
yeah,
know, I like to talk about it, but my American analogy is having a batting coach to fire. Somebody who's going to take the fall.
absolutely,
Um,
absolutely.
but
So
but beyond that, let me just go beyond that for a second.
yeah,
When I talked before about third parties, that accountability could mean that this SaaS is responsible or this fourth party is responsible. So, and so I don't know that accountability necessarily means person or human in the way that it would in a military sense.
yeah, I think that's fair, and I'd say that accountability in this instance means having some lineage as to owning, like, the worst thing is a service account which who no one exists knows who created it or how it ever came around into existence, or who's responsible for managing it going forward, right? So I think accountability in this definition means having someone who can, whether that's a user, whether that's a human, whether that's an entity, whoever, someone who can attest to the sanctity of that entity going forward.
And we can't do anything about the risk if we have no accountability.
Exactly,
So
exactly,
I'm not
exactly,
arguing against accountability here. We definitely need the accountability.
exactly.
I'm just pushing back against it. I think that I've heard it said to me, at identity conferences that I attended within the last year, that accountability meant knowing which human to actually assign blame to.
Yeah.
And while I'm pro accountability, I see a more complex world. Well, I warned you that 35 minutes we would go fast, um, and we're actually at the 41-minute mark or a little over. So I wanted to ask you, if you had any last thoughts or next things that people can look for, events P0 will be at, or anything else before we break.
No, I mean, we are going to be at Identiverse. We're probably also going to be at RSA. So looking forward to engaging with the wider identity and security community at both of these events, if not elsewhere. And otherwise, if the idea of modern PAM built on authorization and just-in-time controls for any identity makes sense, please reach out to us.
Okay, awesome. And with that, I will announce the next episode. Um, actually, one of your competitors will be on. Strong DM is going to be talking about their view on AI agent security, which they presented at Gartner IM. I don't know if you're in the audience, Shashwat, but we'll hear what they have to say. Their approach is normally pretty thoughtful. Um, okay, with that, I guess I will say, Shashwat, it's been a pleasure discussing and learning more about P0. And so thank you for joining us, and thank you, audience, and we'll see you next time.
Likewise, take